Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming week. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're going to explore the Gospel readings suggested for Christmas Eve night or Christmas Day morning, in which we hear Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. Before we dive into that, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet accompanying this study, the link for which is in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of the reading we're going to be looking at, suggestions for other passages you may find it helpful to read, some questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of space to record your own thoughts and observations. But for now, and without further ado, let us dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 1 to 14. The backdrop to the birth narrative, as Luke tells it us, is the calling, as we learn in verse 1, of a Roman census. The purpose of such a census would have been to assess how many people were eligible to pay the tribute tax to the Roman emperor. And as such, the act of calling a census was not a neutral one. It was an expression of power, and it led to a revolt led by Judas of Galilee that was violently and brutally suppressed by the Romans. We know that there are factual difficulties with Luke's attempt to situate the birth of Jesus in historical context in this way. For starters, the first census that we know about in Palestine took place in the year 6 or 7 of the Common Era, and there's very little evidence to support the idea that Quirinius was governor of Syria before the death of Herod, which occurred in the year 4 BCE. And so we know that Herod and Quirinius were not actually contemporaries. And so what we find in chapter 1 verse 5 around that timing just doesn't particularly make sense. And moreover, the census that we know about didn't actually cover Galilee, it only applied in Judea. Galilee had a different puppet ruler. And no Roman census that we know of ever required people to travel to their ancestral hometown to be registered. So I think we need to conclude that what we find in verses 1 and 2 is less history as we might see in a modern documentary, and more something of a dramatic device to explain how it is that Mary and Joseph ended up in Bethlehem. We do have a range of characters appearing in this passage. We have the Emperor Augustus, who was the Roman ruler around the time that Jesus was born. And we do hear about Quirinius, described as the Roman governor of Syria. Obviously, we have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and she would have been very young at that time. It was quite common for Jewish girls to be betrothed at the age of 12 or so, and they would be in that arrangement for a year, it was legally binding, and then they would be married at the end of that time. So when we talk about Mary and Joseph being engaged, we're talking about something that was more of a commitment than would be the case today. Joseph was the earthly father of Jesus, if I can put it like that. He was a descendant of King David, the greatest king Israel had ever had, who had himself been a shepherd. And it's because we're told that Joseph was descended from the line and the family of David that the Holy Family had to go to Bethlehem for the census, as we hear in verse 4. We also have in this passage shepherds. Now, shepherds were very ordinary folk and were very much at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder of their day. And they were poorly regarded in religious circles because their work was a 24-hour commitment. And it made it really difficult for them to keep all the rules around cleanliness and so on that were shaped by the oral law. And it made it very difficult for them to get to regular worship. So they were often regarded as sinful, as unclean. And yet it was these ordinary people who would be the first to receive the good news. And we have angels, divine messengers, who brought the good news to the frightened shepherds, and as we'll see at the end of the passage, praised God en masse. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the 4 New Testament Gospels to be written, around 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and it forms the second of the 2 New Testament accounts we have of the birth of Jesus, the earlier one having come in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. And it's useful as we grapple with this passage to keep in mind some later chunks of Luke, from Luke chapter 4 verses 18 to 19 and chapter 14 verses 13 to 21, because these passages show us Jesus' commitment to marginalised people, such as the shepherd witnesses. Now, this passage forms part of a wider unit, a threefold structure, and it may be that you want to read through to verse 20 as the lectionary offers us an option. In verses 1 to 7 we have the birth of Jesus. In verses 8 to 20 we have the proclamation to the shepherds. And finally in verse 21 we have the reference to Jesus' circumcision. And that threefold structure mirrors what we've heard about the birth of John the Baptist in chapter 1 verses 57 through to 80. Luke begins the narrative by locating it, as we've already talked about, in relation to the powers and principalities within that region. And it makes it clear that the mightiest and ordinary people alike would have their worlds changed by the events narrated in this text, and thus by the yes of the young Mary to God. Joseph responded, we're told, to the demand to be registered for the census by travelling from Mary's hometown, which was Nazareth in Galilee, to Bethlehem in Judea, because the latter, so the city of David, Joseph was his descendant. And so verses 3 to 5 kind of serve to explain some of that journey. The narrative is used to get them in the right place, as it were. And I think the motive for that comes from looking at Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which talks about Bethlehem, one of the least of the clans of Judah, and a miraculous birth in the midst of that. And it's certainly, we know from Matthew chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, the text that Matthew had latched onto to say Jesus was definitely born in Bethlehem. It's significant that Jesus was descended, therefore, from the line of David, from that messianic line, as that messianic imagery had come to be associated with a successor to David's throne who would liberate the people of Israel. But for all of that, we know that Jesus wasn't born in some grand palace, but in a humble stable, as it's often become known, though the word could be translated cave. And the humility of his birth is captured, as we learn in verses 6 and 7, by having been laid in a manger and wrapped in swaddling clothes by his mother. But when we have the commonly translated term no room at the inn, we have to be careful not to imagine that Mary and Joseph had been looking for a Bethlehem travel lodge or something like that and been unable to get a guest's room. No, it was more likely that they were refused space in the upstairs area of houses where people were accommodated, and instead were forced to use a downstairs space because that's where all the animals and so on were kept. So rather than just things were full and they were a bit late, what we're actually seeing here, if we translate the text in that way, in verses 6 and 7, is Joseph having been effectively turned away by his kin in the hour of need. And perhaps it reflects not wanting anything to do with the circumstances of Mary's pregnancy, because it was scandalous to fall pregnant in that betrothal year. Maybe there were other things going on. Maybe they were just too full. But that's what leads to the humble nature of Jesus' birthplace. And that theme of humility and unlikeliness carries on with the reference to the shepherds. As I say, they were at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder. They had no apparent reason to be able to call on the divine. And it shows us that from the beginning, it was marginalised people who were called to Jesus. And it reminds us of another connection to King David. In 1 Samuel 16, we learn that he was a shepherd boy, so there's that obvious link, but also that he was the unlikely person that God chose. He had 7 older brothers who should have been preferred to him based on outward appearances. The shepherds were not the obvious choice to be the first to hear about the birth of Jesus, but that's how God chose to work. Now, given that background, it's not surprising, as we learn in verses 8 and 9, that the shepherds were terrified when they were greeted by an angel as they watched their flocks by night. As I say, it was a 24-hour job keeping the sheep safe. The angels proclaim the good news. And that's good news of a Messiah's birth. So we're back to this image of liberation and new hope we find in verses 10 and 11. And it's something that will have implications for the whole world. The promise of a sign as proof of the veracity of what the angels are saying to the frightened shepherds, we hear about in verse 12, echoes a common pattern that we find in the Hebrew scriptures of a sign pointing to the truth of God's word. So we see that in Exodus chapter 3 verse 12 with the story of Moses, who had his doubts about whether he could convince Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go. We see it in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 34 with the story of Samuel and Eli. And we see it again in Isaiah 38 verse 7 and on any other occasions as the hope of Israel is worked out in the context of exile and disillusionment. Perhaps most tellingly, it might recall Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 and its prophecy about Emmanuel, God with us, coming to dwell with the people. And in verses 13 and 14 we learn that there's a sudden appearance of a mass of angels singing a song of peace and goodwill to all. And that dramatic scene shows us that in what God is doing, heaven and earth have become visible to one another, closer together. And indeed, that's at the heart of the incarnation. This idea that Jesus was God in human form, fully God and fully human. In his person, heaven and earth connect. I hope as you read this story and maybe read on to the shepherds going and finding things as the angels had said they would be, and Mary hearing what they have to say and treasuring those things in her heart, I hope that you find something of the wonder of this amazing truth of God, that God took the risk of being vulnerable and defenseless and coming in human form to very, very ordinary parents and changing everything. And I hope, furthermore, that the questions we'll now consider will help you to grapple more deeply with some of the implications of that.